For most of her life, HMS Barham was exactly what Britain expected a battleship to be. Massive, heavily armed, heavily armored. A ship designed to take punishment and keep fighting. But on November 25, 1941, 3 torpedoes struck her in the Mediterranean. And what happened next was so violent that it was captured on film. Within minutes, Barham would be lying on her side. And then, something inside the battleship would explode. At first glance, the story seems simple. A German submarine fired torpedoes. 3 of them hit. The battleship sank. But that doesn't explain what we're looking at. Because Barham wasn't a lightly protected cruiser. She was a 31,000-ton battleship built to survive the kind of damage that could destroy an ordinary warship. And yet, after the torpedo struck, she went from a functioning warship to a catastrophic explosion in only a few minutes. So what happened inside Barham? How did 3 torpedo hits turn into one of the most dramatic battleship losses of the Second World War? And perhaps most importantly, why did the battleship's own ammunition become part of the disaster? To understand why the sinking of Barham was so extraordinary, you first have to understand what kind of ship she was. Barham was a Queen Elizabeth-class battleship, laid down during the First World War and commissioned in 1915. She carried 8 15-inch guns. She displaced roughly 31,000 tons in her original configuration. And like other battleships of her generation, she was built around one fundamental principle: survive the hit. Her armor protected vital machinery, ammunition spaces, and other parts of the ship. Her enormous main guns were capable of engaging enemy warships at long range. And beneath those guns was an even more important system: the magazines. These were the spaces where the ammunition for the main guns was stored. And that ammunition was extraordinarily powerful. That was the paradox of the battleship. The same ammunition that made Barham such a dangerous weapon could also become one of the greatest dangers aboard the ship if fire or severe damage reached it. But in 1941, Barham was hardly an untested relic. She had already spent decades fighting. Barham had fought at Jutland in the First World War. During the Second World War, she served in the Mediterranean and took part in operations against Italian and German forces. She survived an attempted attack by Italian underwater raiders. She participated in the attack on Taranto. She bombarded Bardia and Tripoli. She fought at the Battle of Cape Matapan. And in 1941, she supported operations around Crete and North Africa. This wasn't a battleship making its first trip into danger. She was a veteran. She had already been shot at, already bombed, already threatened by torpedoes, and she was still in service, which makes what happened next even harder to comprehend. On November 24, 1941, Barham left Alexandria with 2 other battleships, HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Valiant, accompanied by a screen of destroyers. The force was operating in the eastern Mediterranean, supporting operations against Axis shipping and forces in North Africa. The following afternoon, the 3 battleships were operating north of Sidi Barrani. From the surface, everything appeared relatively routine. But beneath the Mediterranean was a German submarine, U-331, and its commander was looking for an opportunity. U-331 was a Type VIC U-boat commanded by Captain Lieutenant Hans Diedrich von Tiesenhausen. The submarine had been operating off the North African coast. And now the British battleships were moving into range. For a submarine commander, this was the kind of target that might never appear again. A battleship, part of a major fleet, moving within torpedo range. The opportunity was there. Now he had to take it. U-331 fired a spread of 4 torpedoes, and 3 found their target. The torpedoes struck Barham's port side. And almost immediately the battleship began to list. One explosion, then another, then another. Men below decks suddenly found themselves dealing with a ship that was no longer behaving like a stable platform. Water was entering the damaged sections. The ship was losing buoyancy and stability. And the list was becoming more severe. One survivor later recalled hearing the explosions in rapid succession and realizing almost immediately that Barham had been torpedoed. But nobody on the surrounding ships had yet seen the full extent of the disaster, because Barham was still afloat. For the moment, it was around 4:25 in the afternoon. And from this point onward, the timeline becomes terrifyingly short. The torpedo strikes had caused massive damage. But the ship did not simply disappear beneath the water. Instead, she began to roll, and she rolled rapidly. For the men aboard her, the sea was no longer beneath the ship. It was beginning to rise toward them. Decks became slopes. Doors became walls. Ladders became obstacles. And everything that had been designed to function on a level ship was suddenly being turned sideways. That explosion is what made the sinking of HMS Barham famous. But it wasn't the beginning of the disaster. It was the final stage. The battleship had been struck by torpedoes. She had rapidly flooded and lost stability. She had rolled onto her side. And then the damage reached something far more dangerous. Her ammunition. Historical accounts describe the ship's aft magazine exploding as Barham rolled over. The exact sequence of internal damage has been discussed in later accounts, but the wartime inquiry associated the fires with the explosion of ammunition magazines. And that is where the real story begins. A torpedo doesn't have to directly hit a magazine to destroy a battleship. That's an important distinction. The torpedoes first had to create the conditions for disaster. They punched into the hull. They damaged internal compartments. They allowed water to flood the ship. And that flooding changed the ship's balance. As Barham rolled farther and farther onto her port side, the situation inside became increasingly chaotic. Meanwhile, fires were spreading through damaged areas. And somewhere inside the ship were thousands of pounds of ammunition and propellant. The battleship was now fighting two enemies: the water outside and the fire inside. This was the terrifying paradox of battleship warfare. The battleship's greatest weapon was also one of its greatest vulnerabilities. A 15-inch gun was powerful because it could throw an enormous projectile across miles of ocean. But that projectile needed an equally powerful propellant charge to launch it. And those charges had to be stored aboard the ship. Normally, the magazines were protected. They were deep inside the hull, isolated from many of the dangers that existed above them. But a battleship is a complicated machine. Damage in one part can create problems somewhere else. Flooding can change stability. Fire can spread. Communications can fail. A ship can lose electrical power. And when a battleship begins rolling violently, escape routes that were perfectly usable minutes earlier can become almost impossible to navigate. That is what made Barham's final minutes so devastating. The ship wasn't simply being damaged. Its entire environment was changing faster than the crew could respond. It's easy to watch the footage of Barham and see only a warship. But there were more than 1,000 men aboard her. And when the ship began to roll, they had almost no time. One survivor, Douglas Lind, was below the bridge when the torpedoes struck. He made his way upward through the ship as Barham rapidly rolled onto her port side. He eventually reached the bridge area and climbed onto the now horizontal starboard side. Then the after magazine exploded. The blast threw him into the sea. Another survivor, Ronald Dando, recalled hearing the explosions and realizing that Barham was going over remarkably quickly. And this is perhaps the most frightening part of the entire story. The men aboard Barham weren't watching a slow sinking. They were trapped inside a ship that was changing orientation in seconds. From the torpedo strikes to the final destruction, the entire sequence was measured in only a few minutes. Different survivor accounts give slightly different timings, but the historical record consistently describes an extraordinarily rapid sinking, roughly 3 to 4 minutes from the attack to the final explosion and loss of the ship. And that speed is critical, because the faster a ship rolls, the less time the crew has to escape. There is no orderly evacuation, no time to lower boats, no opportunity to calmly organize hundreds of men. There is only the instinct to get out, get upward, get clear, and get into the water. More than 800 men were killed when HMS Barham was lost. The exact casualty figure varies between historical records, but only around 450 men survived according to the commonly cited naval history figures. And somehow hundreds did escape. Some were thrown clear by the explosion. Others reached the surface through whatever route they could find. The survivors were eventually rescued by nearby ships. But the battleship herself was gone. A ship that had survived Jutland. A ship that had fought across the Mediterranean. A ship built to withstand enemy fire. Destroyed in minutes. But the story wasn't over. Because while Barham was dying on the surface, U-331 was trying to escape beneath it. The submarine had just fired 4 torpedoes. 3 had hit. And now the British escorts were looking for the attacker. At one point, U-331 surfaced close enough to the British formation to come under fire. The submarine was damaged and hunted, but it escaped. The men aboard U-331 had just destroyed one of Britain's major battleships. And now they had to survive the consequences. So what actually destroyed HMS Barham? Was it the submarine? Yes. Were it the torpedoes? Absolutely. But neither answer tells the whole story. The real killer was the chain reaction. The torpedoes started it. The flooding destabilized the ship. The rapidly increasing list made survival and escape increasingly difficult. And the fire and internal damage ultimately led to the catastrophic magazine explosion. The torpedoes began the disaster. The explosion finished it. And this was one of the great dangers of battleship warfare. Armor could stop shells. Compartments could contain flooding. Damage control teams could fight fires. But no battleship could afford to lose control of all 3 at once. The sinking of Barham also belonged to a much larger history of catastrophic ammunition explosions. At Jutland, HMS Queen Mary and HMS Indefatigable were destroyed after their magazines exploded. HMS Lion narrowly avoided a similar fate when a magazine was flooded after a turret fire. The lesson wasn't simply that battleships were obsolete. It was more frightening than that. It was that even an enormous, heavily armored warship could have a point beyond which damage became irreversible. When you first see this footage, it looks almost impossible. A battleship is sailing normally. Then 3 explosions erupt along her side. She begins to roll. The sea climbs toward her decks. And suddenly, she disappears. But now you know what you're actually watching. Not one explosion. Not one hit. A chain reaction. 3 torpedoes created the initial damage. Flooding destroyed the ship's stability. Fire and internal damage pushed the situation beyond recovery. And then the battleship's own ammunition became the final weapon. HMS Barham had survived a world war. She had fought at Jutland. She had survived attacks, bombardments, and years of service. But on November 25, 1941, 3 torpedoes started a chain reaction that ended her life in minutes. The battleship wasn't destroyed by one event. It was destroyed by everything that happened after it. And Barham wasn't the only battleship whose ammunition turned a successful attack into a catastrophic explosion.